Pontiac doesn't begin in the modern glass offices of Detroit, but in the dust of history and the scent of pine forests. The name that would decades later become synonymous with burning rubber and the scream of V12 engines actually carries the weight of an ancient people. Pontiac was a great chieftain of the Ottawa tribe, a symbol of resistance and strength, a man who fought against a superior enemy to preserve his home. When General Motors decided to name its new brand after him in 1926, they had no idea that this spirit of struggle would become both the curse and the blessing of this mark. In the beginning, Pontiac was envisioned as a friendly car. It was a vehicle for people who wanted something slightly better than a humble Chevrolet but couldn't afford a luxury Buick. It was stable, reliable, and, honestly, a bit boring. As America moved through Prohibition, the Great Depression, and World War II, Pontiac was the faithful companion of the middle class, the gray car in the parking lot outside the church or the grocery store. Its logo was the proud profile of the Indian chieftain, calmly watching the world change. But beneath that calm exterior, in the dark corners of the Michigan factory, a restlessness was simmering. Engineers knew Pontiac could do more. They felt that a brand bearing the name of a warrior should not remain just a means of transportation for retirees. They were waiting for the spark that would ignite that fire. It wasn't just a story about selling cars, it was a search for identity. America was slowly waking up from the grayness. The youth were looking for excitement, and Pontiac was ready to shed its suit and show its war paint. The spirit of the chieftain began to stir, and the automotive world would never be the same again. It was the silence before the storm that would soon tear the chains of corporate decency. In the mid-50s, Pontiac was on the dangerous edge of oblivion. Sales were falling, and the brand's image was so old-fashioned that it was called an old lady's car in Detroit. It was solid but lifeless metal. That's when a man stepped onto the stage who would forever change the DNA of this company semen, Bunky Knudsen. He wasn't just an ordinary director in a white shirt. He was the son of a former GM president and a man who believed a car must have a soul, not just four wheels. His philosophy was clear and brutally honest. You can sell a young man's car to an old man, but you'll never sell an old man's car to a young man. Knudsen entered the factory like a whirlwind. The first thing he did was remove the famous silver streaks from the hood, which had been Pontiac's trademark for years but looked like suspenders on an old suit. He wanted a clean, aggressive, and wide look. He introduced the wide track design, widening the distance between the wheels, making Pontiac the most stable and best handling car on American roads. But visual changes were just the beginning. Knudsen knew that the heart of the car had to beat faster. He started pushing Pontiac onto the racetracks. NASCAR and drag racing became laboratories where a new reputation was forged. Pontiac suddenly became the car that wins, the car that leaves competitors in the dust. Knudsen created an atmosphere where engineers became stars and performance became the only religion. Under his leadership, Pontiac stopped being a transport vehicle and became a statement of intent. It was a transformation rarely seen in industrial history. The brand gained muscle and attitude overnight. America began to notice that spark in the chieftain's eye on the hood. The spirit of the rebel was out of the bottle, and the next step would be even more radical, as a young engineer named John DeLorean emerged from the shadows. The early 60s brought a cold shower for all speed lovers within General Motors. Corporate leadership, fearing public pressure and safety criticisms, issued a strict order: no more official racing, and most importantly, it was forbidden to put engines larger than 5.4 liters into small and medium-sized cars. It seemed the party was over, but in the office of Pontiac's chief engineer sat a man who did not recognize authority: John DeLorean. He was the embodiment of a new era, charismatic, rebellious, and absolutely obsessed with performance. DeLorean knew that young Americans craved speed, and he had a plan to give it to them, even if it meant breaking every rule. In strict secrecy, under the cover of night, DeLorean and his team took a modest Pontiac Tempest and shoved a massive 6.4-liter V8 engine, intended for large cruisers, into it. To deceive corporate auditors, they presented the car not as a separate model, but as an optional equipment package called the GTO, an abbreviation, stolen from Ferrari, that stood for Gran Turismo Omologato. By the time GM management found out what they had done, the prototype was already on the street, and the public's reaction was so explosive that there was no turning back. The Pontiac GTO was born, and with it, an entire era, the muscle car era. The GTO wasn't just a car, it was a hooligan in a suit. It was loud, untamable, and terrifyingly fast at a stoplight. Advertising campaigns called it the Tiger, and teenagers across America dreamed of that sound tearing up the asphalt. This model turned Pontiac into the most desirable brand in the country overnight. DeLorean proved that risk pays off, and that legends aren't made in board meetings, but in the garages of those with the guts to say no to the system. Pontiac became the king of the street, and the GTO was its scepter. However, while the GTO ruled the straights, a new kind of predator was on the horizon that would conquer both the silver screen and the hearts of generations, the Firebird. When the Ford Mustang appeared and conquered America, Pontiac didn't just want to respond, it wanted to dominate. In 1967, the world saw the Firebird, which was much more than an ordinary sports coupe. While the Mustang was a people's car, the Firebird was a sophisticated warrior with sharper lines and that specific Pontiac attitude that screamed, "Get out of the way!" But the real explosion happened when the Trans Am package was introduced. With massive air intakes and the legendary screaming chicken, a giant eagle with outspread wings on the hood, this car became the visual identity of an entire generation that despised subtlety. The 70s were dark for the American auto industry due to the oil crisis, but Pontiac became immortal during that time, thanks to Hollywood. In 1977, the film Smokey and the Bandit turned a black Trans Am with gold details into the biggest movie star on four wheels. As Burt Reynolds escaped the law with screeching tires, every kid in America and around the world wanted that exact car. Sales skyrocketed. People weren't just buying a vehicle, they were buying a piece of freedom, a rebellion against authority, and the scent of gasoline defying the system. The Trans Am became a symbol of a time when it was important to be loud and fast. The Firebird survived decades by changing shapes, from a muscular powerhouse to the futuristic wedge that talked and thought in the series Knight Rider, KITT. During those years, Pontiac was on top of the world. It was the brand that dictated what was cool. However, within GM, a dangerous idea began to grow that all brands should share the same parts for savings. Pontiac's engineers, realizing they were losing their authenticity, decided on a last desperate attempt to make something completely radical, something the world had never seen in American production. That project would bear the name Firo, and it would be the beginning of the end of a great vision. In the early 80s, Pontiac was in an identity crisis. The oil shocks had passed, and the public wanted something more modern than heavy V8 machines. Engineers dreamed of a small, lightweight sports car with a mid-mounted engine, like European exotic models. Thus, Project Firo was born. It was the most ambitious plan in the brand's history. The first American mass-produced mid-engine car with a body made of special plastic panels that never rust. It seemed Pontiac was catching up with the future again, but within General Motors, the administrative walls were higher than ever. Corporate leadership didn't want the Firo to become a threat to their precious Corvette. Therefore, they slashed the engineers' budget and forced them into shameful compromises. Instead of a sports suspension, they got parts from cheap city cars, and instead of a powerful engine, they put in the outdated Iron Duke that choked under its own weight. The savings were so radical that early models had overheating problems and, in some cases, caught fire. The media was merciless, and Pontiac's reputation began to crack under the weight of bad decisions made not by engineers, but by accountants. The tragedy of the Firo lies in the fact that the engineers, despite everything, managed to perfect it. By 1988, the Firo finally became the car it was meant to be from the start: fast, stable, and beautiful. But it was too late. GM, in its typical fashion, decided to kill the project just when it became perfect. It was a clear signal that within the corporation, there was no longer room for risk and passion. The Firo remained a painful reminder of what happens when vision collides with bureaucracy. Pontiac began to lose its edge, becoming just another name on a list of corporate numbers, while the spirit of the Chieftain slowly began to fade in the shadow of identical models flooding the market. The 90s in the history of the American auto industry will be remembered as the era of plastic and blandness. For Pontiac, it was a decade of slowly and painfully losing its soul. General Motors, in pursuit of maximum profit, began applying a strategy where all brands within the group shared almost everything from engines and chassis to door handles. Pontiac, which was once a lone wolf and an innovator, was now forced to wear the same clothes as Chevrolet or Buick, just with a few more plastic body cladding pieces. This was the era of badge engineering that slowly killed everything that made the brand special. Cars like the Grand Am or Grand Prix sold in large numbers, but they were empty. They no longer had that dangerous sound or the attitude that made passers-by turn their heads. Interiors were flooded with cheap, grey plastic and rubberized buttons, while exterior design became too rounded and soft. Pontiac went from a muscular athlete to a middle-aged family man trying to look youthful, but nobody believed him. The legendary Chieftain logo, which once symbolized resistance, now sat on the hoods of cars that were perfectly average. The biggest blow, however, came in 2001 with the Aztec. It was a car that was supposed to redefine the concept of a crossover, but instead, it became a symbol of poor judgment. Declared the ugliest car ever made, the Aztec became an object of ridicule worldwide. Although it was functional and ahead of its time in some ideas, aesthetically it was a total failure. Pontiac became synonymous with kitsch and a lack of direction. While competitors were becoming sharper and more modern, Pontiac wandered in the fog of corporate compromises. Loyal fans looked at their old GTO models with sadness, wondering where the fire and courage that once defined the asphalt of America had gone. Just when it seemed Pontiac had completely lost its compass, something unexpected happened in the early 2000s. Enthusiasts woke up again in the corridors of General Motors. They realized that if they wanted Pontiac to survive, they had to give it back what made it a legend: raw power and excitement. It was a recovery attempt, a final charge before the curtain fell. The first sign of hope was the Solstice, a beautiful little roadster that looked like it had escaped from European fashion runways but carried an American heart. It was the first Pontiac in a long time that people bought solely for emotion, not price. Then came the return to roots. Pontiac imported a beast from Australia called the GTO, and later, a brutal sedan, the G8. These cars were everything Pontiac had neglected for decades: rear-wheel drive, powerful V8 engines, and raw, aggressive power. The G8 GXP was a car that could stand toe-to-toe with the most expensive European sports sedans, proving that engineers hadn't forgotten how to make a machine that commands respect. Enthusiasm returned to the showrooms, and the scent of gasoline became dominant again. It seemed the Chieftain had risen again, ready to reclaim his territory. But while speed lovers rejoiced, black clouds gathered over the world. The economy began to crack. What was supposed to be a new beginning turned into a race against time that no one could win. Pontiac once again had great cars and attitude, but the world was no longer the same place. The 2008 financial crisis hit Detroit like an asteroid, leaving devastation in its wake. Pontiac found itself in the middle of a battle for survival, unaware that its fate was already sealed in the offices of those who don't understand the sound of an engine, only spreadsheets of losses. The hope was brief, but it glowed brightest just before it would be completely extinguished. The year 2009 was the darkest in the history of American industry. General Motors, the giant that had ruled the world for decades, declared bankruptcy. To survive with government help, they had to make a sacrifice. The US government was relentless. GM had to get rid of unnecessary brands. Even though Pontiac was on the road to recovery, even though it had models that were reawakening passion, its fate was destined for the altar of austerity. It was decided that Pontiac, the brand that created the muscle car era, must cease to exist. It was news that resonated like a shot through the hearts of millions of fans across the planet. The last Pontiac, a white G6 model, rolled off the assembly line in October 2009. There were no grand celebrations, only silence and the tears of workers who knew they were closing one of the most important chapters of human ingenuity. The factories fell silent, and the famous red arrow logo with the Chieftain's profile slowly began to fade from the facades of showrooms. Pontiac didn't die because its cars were bad, it died because it was too rebellious for a world that had become too cautious. It was sacrificed so that the corporation could survive, leaving behind a void that no modern electric car will ever be able to fill. But legends don't die on paper, they live on the asphalt. Today, Pontiac lives in the sound of every GTO that flies down a local road, in the gleam of every Trans Am that appears at a classic car meet. It is a reminder of a time when the car was an expression of freedom, not just a means from point A to point B. Pontiac was and remains the spirit of resistance. Even though the factory no longer exists, the spirit of the Chieftain still roams the roads, reminding us that true strength is not measured in horsepower, but in the courage to be different. Pontiac went down in history, but that departure was the final scream of a rebel who refused to give up without a fight.